This series on Mongolian heavy cavalry has taken us from China across Central Asia and now to the western limits of Mongol expansion. In these last two episodes in our series, we look at how the Mongols dealt with two groups of unique, well-armored foes: European knights, including the famous Templars, and next time, the ferocious Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. Let's start with Europe. Of all the armies the Mongols interact with, probably the one with the greatest amount of annoying online speculation are the battles with knights in Hungary and Poland. Popular discussions range from the Mongols cutting through them like a hot chainsaw through butter, to the Mongols being scared off by this unique brand of European heavy cavalry. Both extremes are annoying and not what we see in the historical sources. The short answer is that the sources from the European point of view and the Mongolian indicate that knights were seen as effective foes by the Mongols, but one they were also quite capable of dealing with. When we discuss knights, people tend to picture someone covered in full plate and nearly invulnerable to arrows. Todd Cutler at Todd's Workshop has some really interesting videos on how well plate armor stands up to arrows shot from a longbow. But in the 13th century, knights are not yet in this kind of equipment. Instead, a well-armored knight at the time of the Mongol invasion would be armed like this: a suit of mail on top of or underneath a padded garment like a gambeson, his head protected by a great helm and a large shield at his side. His horse could be protected by barding, padded, or mail. This was top-of-the-line protection, and one not every knight could afford. This is really effective armor, but in the 13th century, it's not particularly unique or better than what's being worn across the rest of Eurasia. Everyone had access to mail in some amount in quality, and mail is also not arrow-proof. Both modern testing has shown this again and again, and our medieval accounts often demonstrate this. For instance, let us look at Jean de Joinville, a French knight in the service of King Louis IX of France, who fought with him in Egypt on the 7th Crusade and was captured by the Mamluks following the disaster at Mansoura in 1250. As this was only a few years after the Mongol invasion of Hungary and Poland, it makes a good reference point. Joinville's account is a fantastic read because it is one of those rare occasions where a person directly involved in the combat wrote about their own experiences in detail. Usually these reports are secondhand, filtered through some churchman or bureaucrat, where the small-scale action of this sort is often glossed over. What we see in Joinville's description is that despite their armor, hundreds of knights were killed. In a single night in the narrow streets of Mansoura, the Ayyubids' Mamluk troops killed some 300 knights. Joinville and his men, wearing at times mail or gambeson, sometimes looted from falling Ayyubids, were injured numerous times by enemy projectiles. He saw how many knights suffered facial injuries from arrows of the Ayyubids' Turkic troops. Now, it was certainly better to go into battle with a gambeson and mail rather than not. In just one day of battle, Joinville suffered 5 wounds from arrows and his horse 15. With lesser armor, Joinville probably would not have survived to write about it. The armor prevented lethal blows to him, but many of Joinville's compatriots were not so lucky. And though he survived the wounds, the injuries were so severe that Joinville and his men could not even put their mail coats on. Against powerful composite bows, mail could be punctured. Even if not a mortal wound, it could incapacitate the wearer. So what about Mongol heavy cavalry in Europe? There's really only one battle where we're given a considerable level of detail from the contemporary accounts that were informed by participants. And that's the Battle of Muhi, fought in Hungary on April 1241. Attested in various European accounts and via the Mongols, appearing in some Persian and Chinese sources as well. Battles through the Rus principalities, Poland, and for the second Mongol attacks over the 13th century give almost no information on the makeup of the armies or the close combat, or come from sources written so much later that their information can only be taken very carefully. And relevant to our discussions of Mongol issues with Kipchaks, the Mongols nearly had to deal with Cumans who had allied with the Hungarians. Had the Hungarians not killed the Cuman leader, causing them to abandon the Hungarians. Some 13th century accounts indicate a minority of Magyars still fought as horse archers, though I am unaware of specific references to them during the Mongol invasion itself. We can presume their presence in these battles, but what their role precisely was is not, to my knowledge, directly stated, though I am happy to be corrected if anyone knows of any charter evidence discussing them, for example. So let's talk about the Battle of Muhi. Once the Mongols entered the Kingdom of Hungary, Batu Khan enticed King Bela IV across the Hungarian plain and tried to make him cross a bridge over the Shio River into a Mongol envelopment. King Bela recognized the trap and stood firm, holding up in a wagon fort some distance away. Having foiled Batu's initial plan, a new ploy was suggested by General Subadai. Batu would advance over the bridge, while Subadai would build an impromptu pontoon bridge further downstream in an effort to outflank the Magyars. For the bridge crossing, Batu entrusted one of his most elite units, men called Ba'atar, heroes who appear to have been well equipped and armed part of the vanguard, one Batu counted on for important missions. Around midnight on April 11th, 1241, the Ba'atar unit crossed the bridge. Unbeknownst to them, two things had gone awry. Subadai's bridge could not be completed on time, and according to the chronicler Thomas of Spalato, a Rus prisoner had escaped the Mongols and warned the Hungarians of the plan. Hungarian cavalry were placed in wait, and once the Ba'atars had crossed the bridge, thundering towards them came the Hungarian knights under King Bela's brother Kalman and the master of the Knights Templar in Hungary. The Mongols were not expecting the attack, and trapped between the bridge and the oncoming knights had little room to move. They were quickly forced back, and in the cramped space on the bridge were subjected to slaughter. Many were tossed from the bridge into the river, including the unit's officer, personally thrown over by Prince Kalman. The crossing had been a disaster. Both European and Mongol sources, at this point many of the Mongol princes wished to pull back. The Hungarian army was large. The first engagement an ill omen, the army tired after 6 years of campaigning. Batu was furious at Subadai, but both men gave speeches to force the princes back into line. A few hours later, still encased in darkness, the Mongols used catapults to break the small guard the Hungarians left on the bridge and then stormed over. Most of the Hungarians had not expected an attack on the same night and had gone to sleep. They'd only realized the attack had begun when arrows fell into the camp, piercing tents and sleeping men. But Prince Kalman and the Knights Templar had expected it. As the Mongol army began to surround the wagon fort, Kalman and the Templars led a charge in good order to drive off the Mongols. Even the Mongols were taken aback, Kalman's charge inflicting a number of casualties upon them. The knights soon returned to the wagon fort, having hoped the effort would have rallied the rest of the Hungarians. It did not, and the camp remained in panic. Convincing only a few to join them, Kalman and his cavalry led another charge. This time, the Mongols were ready. The specifics are not described, but only a few knights escaped alive. Kalman was grievously injured and later succumbed to his wounds. The entirety of the Knights Templar, largely Frenchmen, were killed to a man, including the master of the knights in Hungary. So why was this charge such a failure compared to the first two? Several factors. The first two charges had taken the Mongols by surprise. The third charge they expected. We are also told that Kalman and the knights had stayed awake essentially since arriving at Muhi earlier the previous day, after a week's march across Hungary. By the time of the third charge, men and horse were exhausted from lack of sleep and fighting. Many were perhaps injured from the first two engagements. On that final charge, Kalman's knights likely rode from the wagon fort directly into a hail of arrows. European sources contemporary to the battle had this belief that the Mongol arrows could penetrate any armor. One of the main sources for the battle is Thomas of Spalato, a churchman whose account was informed by a group of high-ranking Hungarian survivors present at Muhi, and commented on the Mongols' extreme accuracy and the arrow's penetration power. We should presume that Thomas's statements reflect the opinion of those who experienced these arrows at Muhi. Even if the mail itself bore the brunt of these shots, gaps, especially in the helmets and the horses they rode upon, were exploited. Once knights began to be picked off and isolated, perhaps the hooked Mongol lances noted by the European accounts pulled the battered knights from the saddle, or a final charge of the Mongolian heavy cavalry itself broke what was left of the resolve of the Hungarian knights. Regardless of how they did it, the Battle of Muhi was decided in Mongol favor as the Hungarian army broke. This sense of picking off and isolating knights is echoed in other encounters. Master Roger, another churchman who was captured by the Mongols in the invasion, tells of an episode before the Battle of Muhi, where an archbishop and his retinue pursued a group of Mongols through a marsh. The knights, weighed down by their armor, became trapped in the marsh. Then they were surrounded by the Mongols, who picked them off with arrows. The archbishop, through means Roger does not tell us, only escaped with 3 or 4 men out of his company. While the Mongols did have the better of these field battles, they were not as easily fought as popularly portrayed. Multiple accounts, from Subadezia and Share Biography, to the Franciscan friar John de Plano Carpina, to Juvaini's Persian language history of the World-Conqueror, report unease among the Mongols before and during the Battle of Muhi, and how the princes wished to withdraw after the debacle on the bridge. Muhi was remembered as a great victory because it was hard fought over a fierce foe, a heroic struggle rather than a mere cakewalk. A belief in the skill of the knights is apparent in a number of sources. Simon of St. Quintin's embassy to Baiju Noyan in the Caucasus in the late 1240s reports how the Mongols had closely monitored King Louis IX's movements as he undertook his crusade, and wanted to ensure that he was directed at Egypt. In the Persian language sources written by those in Mongol service like Juvaini and Rashid al-Din, the Hungarian and Polish armies are only singled out as the horsemen of Keller and Bashkir. Considering that cavalry was the main offensive force of most of the Mongols' enemies, it's interesting to see the knights marked out like this. And we do know that the Mongols thought well of European metalworking. Menka Khan's court in Karakorum was adorned by a great silver tree designed by a French goldsmith the Mongols had captured in Hungary, while the sole reference to the people at the western edge of the world in the secret history of the Mongols is a reference to the quality of their swords. But we should not overstate this too much. While the knights were troublesome, and not something to be taken lightly, they were not seen as an insurmountable barrier. For years after the invasion, the Mongols continued to indicate their willingness to organize a proper conquest of Europe, and it is argued that Guyo Khan may have been in the midst of starting one when he suddenly died in 1248. The reason for the Mongol withdrawal from Europe in 1242 I have dealt with in detail in this other video series I did with Dr. Stephen Pao. As for this series, next time we look at the Mamluks of Egypt and the Battle of Ain Jalut and the difficulties they gave the Mongolian cavalry.